Okay. Hello and welcome to this episode of Unboxing Russia. My name is Pradnya. I am a media studies scholar by training and an avid enthusiast of international relations. And with me is Ekaterina Schulmann, a Russian political scientist. And as always, we want to unbox some complex topics concerning Russia and some about India as well. So today's conversation will largely focus on the new cabinet, if one might call that new. We'll come to that in a while, and some of the implications and a few other interesting topics as well. So, Ekaterina, in the last episode, we both spoke about the fall of the deputy of the defense minister, Mr. Shoigu, and we both had our own set of speculations as to why this was happening and what could one expect. And I think both of us were right in certain ways. There was some massive reshuffling coming in, but also in the spirit of maintaining some kind of stability. So. Before we go into the political meanings of it, let's talk about the people who are involved. So Mr. Shoigu has now been named as Secretary of Russia's Security Council. So what does the Security Council represent, and why has Mr. Shoigu been put into this particular institution, if one might call it that?
Yes, last time we were making, I wouldn't call it speculations on our level of expertise. I think we should call it educated guesses as to what these changes mean and what changes exactly are likely to occur. Now that we are talking, we already have the fully composed cabinet, the newly established government, the civic part and the Siloviki part as well. This is to remind you that according to the amended Russian constitution, the lower chamber of the parliament now approves the candidatures submitted by the president of the civic part of the government, and the heads of the law enforcement, of defense ministry, Minister of Foreign Affairs, they are approved by the Federation Council, the upper chamber. So there's some shadow of parliamentarism for you. So we have the cabinet, and we have also some related changes in the presidential administration. These are, I would say, connected vessels. There's a certain pool of places where you can put people. For example, we have 5 governors that have been simultaneously moved to Moscow to various positions. This means that 5 regions now have vacancies and will have to have whatever stands for gubernatorial elections these days in Russia. So there are places in the presidential administration, in the Kremlin, and there are places in the cabinet. And for example, one of the chairs of parliamentary committees is now advisor to the president. So there's a vacancy there. And it's all very much like the popular kindergarten game of musical chairs, which I was surprised to learn doesn't belong exclusively to the Soviet Union childhood, but seems to be the international thing. So should we explain what the game is about? Or everyone should just remember the traumatizing memories of their kindergarten childhood?
I think people should know that you have a very specific bond with this particular game. So maybe you should explain it a little in your own words.
Okay, the game consists in some chairs being placed in the middle, and there's music being turned on, and children are made to run around those chairs. And when the music stops, you have to take a seat. And with every round, there's 1 chair the less. Yes. So the competition is higher. The difference between this game and this authoritarian reshuffling is that you actually have a stable number of chairs. You can even add new chairs, you can invent them, but they are not of the same size and hate. They are not of the same importance. And this brings us back to your question about the Security Council and the replacements that are taking place there. When we were making our educated guesses 2 weeks ago, we were supposing that it will be very much in the style of the president of Russia, not to orchestrate a downfall of the Minister of Defense, whose deputy has been very publicly arrested. And since then, another high-ranking person in the Ministry of Defense, the head of the personnel department, has been detained as well. So the process is ongoing. It has not stopped, but it will be, we thought, very much in his style to let this weakened figure stand rather than just to let him go. Under the motto, keep your friends close and your enemies closer, keep those people whom you want to degrade not too far away from you, so that you don't have a discontented somebody who is still the head of his clan and still has the clientele and people dependent on him and people who would want him to rise again. So this is how coup d'etats can be formed. So we have witnessed the, downgrading of two important old-timers, political heavyweights, the Minister of Defense and the Secretary of the Security Council. Security Council as such is a consulting body. Its main strength lies in 2 points. First, permanent members of Russian Security Council are exactly the people who rule Russia. They are the top officials of the country. The president, basic ministers, head of presidential administration, heads of the 2 chambers, and a few other key top persons, decision makers. And they have their weekly meetings. Every week since year 2000, for 25 years, they've been meeting in a protocol phrase to discuss questions of internal and external policy. So this is the meeting place of the most important people in Russia. And the second point of strength of the Security Council is that it has a secretariat, an apparatus, and it also has an expert council. It is called a scholarly or science council. It consists of almost 200 people, academicians, scientists, retired generals, a lot of them, and they are supposed to help with crafting strategic documents, strategies of development of various spheres of the life of the country. And since security as a concept is extremely broadly understood, there's a concept of security of everything, from food policy to youth policy, demographic, to say nothing of security per se, as in internal security and external security of the country. And these strategies are then published and adopted by presidential decrees. And all the rest of the legislative work of the government and other legislating bodies has to be based on these strategies. So whenever you have a new federal law or amendments to the existing federal law, in the preamble it says, according to the strategy such and such, we introduce this legislation. So the now ex-secretary of the Security Council and chair of the Security Council is the president. So we have the secretary. The now ex-secretary created for himself a kind of position similar to the one that in Soviet times was called the secretary of the Central Party Committee for Ideology. Combined with something similar to the United States Security Counselor to the president position. So he was, as such, an extremely influential person. But before Patrushev became secretary of the Security Council, various other people occupied this position. And under their rule, it was not that important. Because, again, de jure, it is still only a consulting body. It's not a ministry. When you're a minister of something, defense or transport or education, you have your own staff, not just in Moscow, in the capital, but also branches of it in every subject of the federation, in every region of Russia. You have budget. You have your own prerogatives, administrative powers, which again belong to you, no matter what. So there can be a stronger or a weaker minister, a more or a less capable one, but a ministry is still a big thing, especially if it's a resource-rich ministry, like the one for oil and gas, or again, defense. But other positions, like this position of Secretary of the Security Council, they depend more on personalities. So we have yet to see whether Mr. Shoigu, the ex-defense minister, will be able to step into his predecessor's shoes or not, or whether it's just the way to keep him on one hand close to the president, on the other hand in honorary retirement or semi-retirement.
Out of a sphere of influence, in a sense.
Yes, because he was, again, as defense minister, he was the head of a state within the state. The Russian military machine is huge. Yeah. Russian military spending has skyrocketed. It has always been pretty big. And the Minister of Defense always owned a lot of things, from its own real estate to influence over and resources to dispense on military-industrial complex. So it's evidently a much, much more substantial position. And it is also interesting that the previous Secretary of the Security Council is now assistant to the president, which again is one of those positions where you can be very influential. Some of the presidential assistants, there are advisors don't matter, and there are assistants. Assistants prepare documents for the president on those spheres they're responsible for. For example, one of the presidential assistants that is responsible for culture is supposed to be more influential than the Minister of Culture. So again, this is one of those bureaucratic posts that depend on personalities. So
and also allows a personality to fill in the role with as much influence as they can.
Yes, exactly. So you see, those two big wigs are now in similar positions. They have not stepped down exactly, but their new positions are certainly less than their previous ones. But they also have opportunities, which they can use or fail to use. So that's
talking about opportunities, I think, because we started this conversation with Mr. Shoigu being kind of, being relieved of his office of being the defense minister. And the person who has now filled in his shoes is Andrei Belousov, if I'm not mistaken.
You are absolutely right.
So, and he is like a former economic advisor. He has held different roles in different administrations since, I think, about 20 years now, if I have it right. But still, he is largely a mystery. Like he's not one of those names that has always been around on the circuit. It's a known name, but you don't know what to do with that. So, because we are unboxing and unpacking a lot of these complexities, I think it also is relevant to talk about people, because complexities and realities are constructed by people. So Mr. Belousov coming into office, I think it's being read, especially in the West, as a sign that the defense ministry needs to kind of get the economics right, the war economics right, because it's kind of turning out into a really drawn-out war than had been anticipated. So maybe that's the reason why he's been brought in, and to kind of
at least that's a publicly proclaimed reason. We have had
what's your
explanations. It is interesting that, again, as far as I understand, for the English-speaking audiences, this new appointee is something of a mystery, although he is not some shadowy influencer suddenly stepping from the sidelines to the limelight. He's been occupying very public positions for the last 20 years, as you said. Generally, with all this reshuffling, we have seen no new faces. It is all people who have been around for decades. Even
But then why go for an economic advisor than a defense strategist is the question.
Yes, he was an economic advisor to the president. He was the Minister of Economic Development. Again, it's a very official public position. And his last post was that of the first deputy prime minister, the vice premier. So again, he was not hiding somewhere, whispering ideas in the president's ear. But he was not that public in a sense that he did not speak publicly that much. Although he gave interviews, it was not like he was, again, particularly secretive. But for example, Patrushev, whom I will always regret because he was one of my favorite authors, used to speak a lot. He was evidently fond of giving interviews, and he was writing articles, and he was explaining his worldview, which has been described by some unfriendly inclined Western commentators as barking mad. I wouldn't go that far, but he was certainly very colorful in explaining his conspiratorial picture, yes, to the general public. And he was particularly keen on the Anglo-Saxons. So, the evil Anglo-Saxons, you will understand.
Of course.
And you will probably sympathize because you know Anglo-Saxons are behind almost everything evil that is going on in the world. So, Belousov he was interviewed from time to time because it's the thing that members of the cabinet do, even in such a secretive political system as Russians. But so his views are public, and he's particular in having views because Russian officials for the last 15 years were not encouraged to have agendas of their own. The modish term have been technocrat, a technocrat. You might have heard about it.
I was about to say that.
A technocrat is somebody who is being set a task and thinks how to achieve the task without giving thought to the rationality or the necessity of achieving it. So he is good, or she is good at having things done. Well, Belousov is the opposite of a technocrat. He is an anti-technocrat. He's a person with an ideology, with an agenda. He's not just an economist. He's I would say, hereditary economist. His father was a Soviet economist, a notable one, a member of the Soviet academia. And his son was in the same line since his young days. By convictions, he's a proponent of the planned economy. Not exactly of the Soviet kind, but still he believes that the government should be heavily involved in managing the country's economy, and it should manage it by spending. He's a fan of high-level governmental spending, and specifically of investing in infrastructure. So, spending, investing in infrastructure, governmental control, and cheap credit. You will perhaps notice that these views are in opposition to the views of the majority of Russian financial economic bloc. People who run the Ministry of Finance, Central Bank, Ministry of Economic Development, and the like. I'm not an economist myself, neither are you. But even for a non-economist, it's evident that the so-called monetarists are people who are rather in favor of lower spending, austerity in budgetary planning, and they also believe in higher interest rates for the sake of controlling inflation. This is what the central bank does. And they are supposed to have been extremely successful in countering the effect of sanctions and economic isolation. As a first deputy minister, Belousov has been the public opponent of the financial economic bloc of the same government. For the record, central bank is not part of the government. Even in Russia, it's a partially independent body. But still, we can unite the Minister of Defense, the Minister of Economic Development, to some extent the Minister of Trade and Central Bank into one entity. So, what has the president done in his role of the preserver of this great equilibrium? He has removed this differently thinking person from that part, the civic part of the government. Now he is on the other side of the barricade. He's on the receiving end. He's head of the ministry that is getting a lot of money. And he's been set there to control the spending of that money and to make it as effective as he possibly could. And he's not just the new minister, he's the minister in whose ministry arrests are taking place every week. So the purge is ongoing. And if you remember, we have mentioned that there were some rumors from anonymous sources that the real reason for these arrests was not corruption, because corruption is a thing, of course, but suspicions of state treason. We were saying that it's a dangerous thing if it continues to be mentioned. I must say that I've been watching this plot, whether there's development or not. No development so far. So the more or less public version is that people in the Ministry of Defense under the ex-minister have been stealing too much. They've been squandering resources, not just stealing. And since military spending is so high, and of course there's the special military operation ongoing, there's an actual offensive going on right now in Ukraine, offensive by Russian forces. So at that time, there should be a person in a Ministry of Defense who will take care that money is being spent on something that that actually works. So it's an interesting.
He's also credited for the unmanned drones that are like for the production and enabling a quick production of the unmanned drones that are now making it a little challenging for the Ukrainian defense forces.
That's an interesting story in itself. Again,
and you don't think it's creditable? The story?
Again, it's interesting. Let me try to describe it. I have to be careful here because, again, not only am I not an economist, I'm also not a military expert, but still. It became evident very soon after the start of the war that drones are a game changer, or is a game changer. And that drone technology ought to be pursued if Russia wants to proceed in this war. What Belousov did, what his initiative was this. Unlike in Ukraine, where you have a lot of competing small entities creating those drones and creating new ways of making them, in Russia, it was decided, and again, that was Belousov's project, to choose among the many competing producers of drones in Russia, one which was supposed to be the best for whatever reason, and invest a lot of money into it in order to, enlarge the production dramatically. That was done. But then it appeared that while Russia was able to make a lot of drones, they were all of the same kind. Again, I'm not going to get into technicalities here in order not to embarrass myself with getting things wrong. But again, to explain it in the most general terms, they were all the same. So it was possible for the Ukrainians to calculate the trajectory of those drones and to disable them. Again, this is governmental planning and investment for you. On one hand, it allows you to very quickly scale up, massively scale up whatever you need to do. But at the same time, you create a kind of elephant, which is an easy target, while your opponent creates a lot of flies. And they're different kind of flies. They buzz in a different tune. So you have hard time catching them, and they sting you. If not to death, at least they inflict damage. And this is what Ukraine does to Russia. Again, this is a story. It's not quite a success story, although it's not quite a story of a failure, because numbers matter. Even if you know how to disable this particular drone, if there's so many of them, you may not manage. So you see, it's not quite, again, it's not a black and white story.
No, I brought this up because it is connected to my following question, which is the image of Mr. Belousov. When he was brought into office, does he come with a perception of being a fairly clean technocrat in an ecosystem which is otherwise popularly also perceived as a very corrupt ecosystem? Because we also want to talk about the hunger for justice in a sense, in the public perception. So last time we spoke about why this deputy had to take the fall. The trumped-up charges were mostly of corruption, and even if they had kind of gotten out with state treason, it is still a very legitimate charge, which kind of then, feeds into the whole conversation of getting justice, like doing the right thing. So let's just assume that this new person, Mr. Belousov, is a very clean person. So he kind of serves two purposes. One is kind of get the pressure off Mr. Putin, because now he's brought in a very clean person, has put him in a position which is very influential, and he can say, I'm not exactly the best bud with this guy, but I got him in because he gets the job done. And at the same time, this is also a guy who is in his position as an economic advisor, has proven that he can get things done. He can get the infrastructure, he can get the equipment that his generals need. He can procure them, he can get them produced at a very quick pace. So, it's kind of also aiding the whole war effort in Ukraine. So I'm just wondering how you see to that perception.
I would fully agree to your first point, and not completely to your second one about justice and the need for justice, and then some sort of cleanliness as far as it is possible in such a thoroughly corrupt system as the current Russian autocracy, which has been called kleptocracy by some, and to an extent it is true. But Deputy Minister of Defense has not just been arrested, first detained, then arrested. He's been publicly shown to be wallowing in luxury. There's been searches in his house, it's been filmed, and it all got into the public space. And it's the usual thing when you have those press releases of the law enforcement ministries saying that we have found that so many, shoe boxes full of cash and 120 golden watches and icons and other, luxury.
So it's kind of obscene luxury.
Yes. The filthy rich lifestyle. This said Timur Ivanov, the Deputy Minister of Defense in question, even before he was arrested, he was rather famous for his lifestyle, again, even by Russian standards. And in the second world, there's more tolerance for the luxury of the people on top, because it is supposed to be some sort of right. Their right, because, the bosses, they live like that. They dress in gold. They eat and drink of the best. And an average person is supposed to, kind of hate them for it, but at the same time to think that if I were in their place, perhaps I'd do the same. But even by Russian standards, that was over the top. He also used to marry society stars. First one and then the other. And there was this kind of stories which in Russian we called Santa Barbara, in the memory of a soap opera, which was one of the first soap operas shown to the Russian audience in the early days after the Soviet Union. So when there is a kind of complicated family story of, for example, wife of the one official coming over and to marrying another official, then we call it Santa Barbara. So there was a lot of these things around him. By contrast, Belousov is a rather austere person. He's also known for not being head of the clan, or in a more neutral terms, he doesn't have a team. When he was moving from one position to another, like from the Minister of Economic Development to the Deputy Prime Minister, he was not bringing anyone with him, or he was not finding places for people who used to work under him. He just has the head of his secretariat. For the last 10 years, they've been working together, and that's it. And again, by Russian standards, he is not corrupt. As I said, he is an ideologically driven person. He has convictions. That's not typical. But coming to your second point. Yes, your second point, whether he has a reputation of having things done. As I said, he's not a technocrat. He's the opposite of a technocrat. Technocrats have a reputation for managing, for effective management. He's been known to, at least twice, collect a gathering of Russian oligarchs and telling them that they have made too much profit in the last 6 months or a year, and the budget needs money, so you'd better, just have a voluntary collection and donate to the motherland. We do not know whether it was a fully successful thing, but it kind of shows what sort of man that is. There have been consequences to this talks, of course, not public talks. Some of the oligarchs complained to the president that they're being squeezed for money. Again, not for bribes, but for voluntary contribution to the general welfare of the country. Yes, for the general welfare. And at least in one case, it is supposed that money were forthcoming. And this example with the drones, the Sudoplatov story, that's the name of the producer, that's been chosen for massive state investment, is not exactly a success story. As I said, it's not a fully story of failure, nor is it a story of success. So I have my doubts.
But exactly the reason why we needed to address it, because otherwise, there stands a danger that it may be perceived in a binary. It's either a success story or it's a failure story. And we miss the complexity of it. We miss the nuance of where this person is to be pegged on the game field. So I think that's why it's also important to talk about this, about the success plus failure story of one person.
Depending on the way you look at it. But speaking of sacrifices to the public demand of justice, it is known that in societies with high degree of inequality, which is both Russia and India are,
we are absolutely free of all of those problems. We don't have them anymore.
No, not really. What's your Gini index?
I don't want to talk about that.
So the term is not familiar to you, I'm sure. Let me rephrase the question. In this country of national unity and equality, which is the modern day India, do you have cases when, for example, those in power throw somebody among themselves under the bus to show to the public that they care for justice? Do you know of such cases?
In the past, quite a few times. But to be fair, I think in the past few years, especially under the current regime, I think those kind of throwing under the bus mechanism has either been done away with, partly because of the the complicity of the media, of the national media, which is not even state-owned. So even if there is a big story in the making which kind of targets someone who is very close to the government, the story gets underplayed or it doesn't get reported. So then, which kind of leads to this person getting a clean chit because, there are no consequences for this person. So ranging from cases being brought in against industrial tycoons, which are very close to the government of the day, and those cases then getting extremely underplayed. The number of such throwing under the bus things has reduced, especially of people who are close to the regime. When you talk of the opposition, the story is a little different because, of course, when it's the opposition, you're always willing to look for even this tiniest amount of dirt and smudge and whatever one may be able to find. And the moment you have it, you kind of wait for your time, you bide your time, and then you bring it out just around an election cycle in either one of the states. Or right now we had it just before the beginning of the federal elections, which started in April, where a sitting chief minister of the state of Delhi was under arrest for a set of charges that had been, it was not a new set of charges, but they decided to act on those charges. All of a sudden.
Were they corruption charges or generally economic crimes or something else?
It was a mix, in my understanding. Like you said, I would. It's a far cry for me to say that I would be an economic expert on, but I think it's a combination of corruption plus abusing office in a sense. To get a lot of financial transactions.
That's corruption. That's textbook corruption.
Yeah. So no, I'm just trying to fit in the multiple levels of all that it involved. But that was something that they decided to act upon just before the election and not in the run up to the elections or not 2 years before when it actually, or a few years before when it was actually relevant. So yeah, I think they use it very selectively. But India has had this history of, and India, I think most of a lot of other countries, we love our cult kind of, mentality. So we are obsessed about a person quite more than often. It's not always about the ideology.
So do you think that people enjoy the spectacle of a rich person or a high-ranking person in handcuffs? Do you think it's a universal emotion?
Let me bring up this case of a businessman which came out a few years ago, which was Vijay Mallya. He was from the southern part of India. He owned a brewery. He came from a fairly rich family, and then he owned a set of airlines, and he just went on getting a series of loans and securing credits from state institutions and all of that. And then there was a massive downfall. And then he escaped. And since then, he's been hiding away in London.
Oh,
but
so he has not been brought to justice.
No. No.
So there was no enjoyable spectacle for people to watch in this case.
But I think there were people who found out the place of his hearing in London, and then they would hound those places, and it was a massively publicized debate. So people would, of course, then the media always needs to have breaking news all around the clock these days. 24/7 is always breaking news. So then they would come up with either really very interesting pieces of imagination about stories concerning this one particular guy, or sometimes there was some element of truth to it. But he was all over the news, over the news, whichever regional language, whichever national media outlet you want to subscribe, he was all over it. And he's someone who is still missing. He's not been brought to justice, and that's not something we talk about.
No,
he's a figment of the past.
That's not the same story exactly, but I think it illustrates the same mechanism in societies where there's manifest inequality, and especially in a society where there's little independence of judiciary and therefore not much hope for justice for those higher up. The system, in order to preserve itself, has from time to time make these sort of sacrifices of somebody of their own, and we could say that it serves as some sort of substitution for checks and balances that don't exist in an autocracy, or rather they do exist, but they exist in the form of the balance of clans and also of this constant threat hanging over all their heads that they can get detained and arrested at any moment. It is, I think, of interest that we were talking about it a bit last time, that there was evidently a sort of pause on high-ranking repressions among the elites, not among the people, not among the opposition or the activists, journalists. That's a different track. But among the elites, after the war, there have been no new high-profile cases. And once the electoral exercise was over in the second half of March, we saw, not just from the news, but even from agglomerated statistics, a sharp increase in a number of new cases and arrests among officials, federal and regional, among officials in state corporations, and in business bodies connected to the state in other ways. And the process continues. As we have said, in the Ministry of Defense, there are now new people that are being detained, quite high-ranking people. There were also arrests in the Federal Customs Service and in the regions, including my native Tula region, which has just lost its governor, who went to Moscow to become assistant to the president. And just like a couple of days after he left, the head of the regional migration service, together with 3 other people in the same service, were arrested. Well, detained at first. I'm not sure if they were arrested. So it looked like the governor of Tula, to explain, is a former bodyguard to the president. And he's supposed to be fond of him. I mean, the president is supposed to be fond of his bodyguard. So he made him, he was for a short time, by the way, deputy head of Ministry of Defense. Then he went to become the governor of Tula region. And Tula region is very much the place for military-industrial complex. The economy of the region more or less consists of these industries that produce something for the military. And he was a governor there for, I think, like 8 years or more. And now he moved to Moscow. So it looks like this. It was supposed to be indecent, perhaps, to arrest somebody under the governor who is so close to the president. But once he has left, thinks the FSB, they usually have the leading role in these investigations and arrests, now we can move freely. So it generally looks like these dogs of war, or rather dogs of intra-elite repressions, were kept on a leash since the beginning of 2022. But starting March 17th, 2024, somebody let them out. It is interesting because it shows autocratic logic. Why there was a moratorium in the first place? Perhaps it was more important to show the unity of the elite rather than to show that we're still fighting corruption. Perhaps it was advisable to let them do their job without fearing that they're going to be arrested tomorrow, because the external pressure was so great, because the system got itself into such a tight corner. So if we make this educated guess, then why was the moratorium ended? Are we to suppose that now the system is so comfortable within itself, or the Siloviki got so tired of waiting, and they're so hungry after this long pause that it is no longer possible to keep them quiet.
To keep them off.
Yes. Or again, maybe the system is sure of itself and thinks that we can both have an offensive and a reshuffle in the Ministry of Defense. When you come to think of it, it's a rather risky step. When you are in the middle of a full-scale offensive, you not just have a new minister who is completely alien to the army and to the ministry, but you also have a rather wide purge. Again, you can only do that if you are pretty sure that the system will work anyway. So it's an interesting, if our logic is correct, then it's an interesting reflection on the state of mind of those, or of the 1% of people who make this sort of decisions. Do you think repressions tend to discipline the elite or make havoc in a bureaucratic machine? Because no one can be quite sure whether they're going to wake up tomorrow to the knock at the door, just to the sound of the door being broken down.
So I think the answer is a little complicated than that, because I think repressions in any kind of a system, especially if it's a completely authoritative system or a system that has a lot of tendencies towards authoritative regimes, I think repression as a tool can have a win-win situation for all the parties included. So it's like I scratch your back and you scratch mine in a sense. So if I, as a member of the social elite, I agree to take the fall for a particular issue that's boggling the autocratic government in power, then I certainly, as an elite myself, am sure that there is a payoff for me in it, which is involved, which no one knows about. But I know that my dues will be settled. If not today, then maybe tomorrow. So this way, I get to win in the long run, but my government gets to take the win in the short run. And for the public perception, there is an injustice that has been done, and then the government of the day has kind of risen to the occasion and has corrected the injustice, in a sense, to break it down in very blunt terms. So I think repressions could have that impact on the elite, which is a very different story from the impact of repressions on a civil society.
Yes, that's a whole different track. We'll need to talk about that too, while generally discussing the role of violence in the preservation of power.
Because I refer to it in the context of the Indian example. So, like I said, there are these industrial tycoons like Mr. Ambani, Mr. Adani, who are at the helm of economic power and in all their complete glory. And these are the kind of people who are untouchable. No matter what they do, how much obscene flashing of their wealth they do, there will be very less repercussions for them in a way. They don't pay for it. They may be kind of, ridiculed to a certain extent by some second level, third level party leader who's really of no consequence in the larger game. But the party will kind of put a tick on the list and they'll say, oh, of course, we kind of condemned it.
So we speak up against the strong ones in the land.
Yeah. But I think so. Repressions is a very fascinating topic, and depending on who is at the receiving end and who is looking at the repressions, I think there are multiple stories that can be told from different perspectives. So, yeah. But I think that has given us an idea for our conversation next time.
Yes, perhaps. My final point would be that all the things that we have discussed, very varied personalities and institutions and changes, reshuffling and repressions, they all kind of boil down to the system's attempt to preserve power. Again, no system of power can exist without checks and balances. But
Absolutely.
Democratic checks and balances serve to protect society and, to an extent, the elites themselves against an autocrat who will repress them, who will prosecute them. But authoritarian checks and balances are constructed to protect an autocrat against any threat to his power, either from society, which should not be allowed to unite to form parties or labor unions, or to protest, or to have free media, and also against the elites that should be at the same time close to the autocrat, but yet they should not be able to become too strong or, again, too dissatisfied, because statistically, autocracies, especially personalist autocracies, more often fall victims to coup d'etats than to mass protests.
But that's why we are doing this podcast, because I think so far the domestic political system of the country that you represent and the country that I come from and like to talk about a lot, I think India is still an accessible black box, but Russia continues to be a much bigger black box. And I think since we have started this conversation, now we are giving these faceless social elites in the Russian political context a face. So today we spoke about a lot of these people who have unimaginable power, but sitting on the outside, it's very difficult to fathom the depth of that power and the implications of the power that these people hold.
So it's good for the public that we're here to do the explaining and to make educated guesses.
Yes, absolutely. So I think we have a really great job cut out for ourselves next time to talk about checks and balance systems in democratic or other forms of statehoods.
And also about violence as a kind of power-preserving tool, which is both useful and dangerous.
Absolutely.
So hope to see you in the next 2 weeks.
Yes. Thank you so much for the conversation, Ekaterina.
Thank you.